Welcome back to the Curiosity Dude. Today, we're embarking on an incredible journey through time to explore how ancient humans migrated and filled every corner of the planet. From the first steps out of Africa to the farthest reaches of the globe, discover the fascinating stories of our ancestors' epic travels. How did they do it? What challenges did they face? Buckle up and get ready for an adventure through history that shaped the world as we know it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more mind-blowing insights into our past. Migration of ancient humans. How did we fill the entire planet, and how did it all happen? It's clear that not only did humans spread out, but so did our distant ancestors. This process has been going on forever, starting from way back in the Paleozoic era. But let's focus on our own history. Before we dive into human migrations, let's catch up on some news. Surprisingly, new findings keep emerging about events that happened thousands of years ago. In 2020, there were new discoveries about Neanderthal migrations. It turns out, Siberia was populated by Neanderthals at least twice. We don't have many Neanderthal sites in Siberia, but new studies and findings are painting a clearer picture. It appears that Neanderthals living in Denisova Cave and those in Okladnikov Cave weren't the same groups. Even though these caves are pretty close to each other, biologically and culturally, these Neanderthal groups were different. And the differences were pretty significant. They differed in DNA, morphology, what little we have, and culture. It seems the Neanderthals in Denisova Cave arrived first, where the Denisovans were already living. These Neanderthals mixed with the Denisovans and later with Homo sapiens too. They had their own culture and workshop. Then, about 50,000 years later, the Okladnikov Neanderthals with their own Mycoquien culture showed up. They had different mitochondrial DNA and set up camp in Okladnikov Cave. It's clear they didn't just stay put, they were hunters and gatherers, moving around. The Okladnikov Neanderthals also mixed with Homo sapiens. Interestingly, in the same layers of Okladnikov Cave, you can find bones of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. This shows that migration wasn't just a straightforward journey. It was a complex web of movements. It's easy for us to see these patterns today, but it wasn't always obvious that ancient migrations were so dynamic. As hunters, our ancestors had to keep moving to survive. They couldn't just stay in one place, or they would have run out of food. And if we look further back, the same thing happened not just with humans, but with primates too. Let's rewind to the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, the transition from the world of dinosaurs to the age of mammals. There, we meet some mysterious creatures called adapiforms. Adapiforms were intriguing little critters, potentially our distant cousins rather than direct ancestors. Their migration story is quite curious. The oldest adapiforms were found in India. At that time, India was an island floating in the Tethys Sea, isolated from Asia, Africa, and Europe. Fast forward a bit to the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and adapiforms pop up in North Africa and Europe. This is puzzling because, back then, North Africa was separate from Asia, Europe was separate from Asia, and India was still an island. How did these small primates cross vast oceanic distances? Not just them. Indian fauna included land turtles and non-aquatic snakes, which also managed to migrate between continents. Most likely, they traveled on floating vegetation rafts. Tropical rainforests with large trees could end up in the water after falling from riverbanks. For small creatures ranging from cockroach size to small monkeys, like the adapiforms, these trees were entire worlds. They could live on these floating rafts for days, maybe weeks, being carried across the ocean by currents. Sure, the chances of survival on these makeshift rafts were slim. But when you multiply millions of trees falling into rivers over millions of years, the odds aren't quite zero, especially for small creatures. These kinds of migrations happened repeatedly. Fast forward to the 16th century, Portuguese explorers followed the same ocean currents, knowing there was land across the ocean because driftwood from America occasionally washed up on African shores. Where there's driftwood, there's land. So they set sail and found it. Meanwhile, northern Spaniards had their own routes. And while they sailed on ships, our distant primate ancestors used logs. Multiply millions of logs over millions of years, and sure enough, they made it across. In fact, recent discoveries show that a group of parapithecids, previously known only from North Africa, existed in South America. Parapithecids were primitive monkeys, and finding them in Peru, on the other side of the Atlantic, is mind-blowing. These primates had to cross the entire African continent before making the ocean journey. In the tropics, traversing forests wasn't that difficult. They spread across Eurasia too, from France and Spain all the way to China. It's fascinating that our direct human ancestors were some of the biggest homebodies. While monkey-like primates spread from the Iberian Peninsula to East China and India, our ancestors stayed put in Africa for a long time. They only ventured out to places like the Middle East and parts of Eurasia much later. Human-like apes, even the smaller ones, weren't keen on moving far from their trees. As long as the climate was favorable and forests were plentiful, they stayed where they were comfortable. Though human-like apes originated in Africa, some, like orangutans and gibbons, eventually made it to places like Indonesia. But our very own human ancestors were the slowest to move out of Africa. While horses, pigs, jackals, hyenas, antelopes, elephants, and ostriches moved between continents, our ancestors were content in Central and East Africa, reluctant to leave until much later. This modern hypermobility of humans is a very recent development. When our ancestors evolved into bipedal beings, like Australopithecus, they were still mainly in East and South Africa. They ventured a bit into the Sahel zone, south of the Sahara, which was not a desert then but more like steppe. However, they didn't move much beyond these regions. Australopithecus moved through semi-open environments, not quite forests, but not complete grasslands either. This created distinct differences between East and South African populations, which we can identify as separate species. This gradual transition from one region to another is somewhat similar to what we see in modern baboons. Africa is vast, with different baboon species living in various regions. Just like our Australopithecus ancestors, these baboons don't tend to migrate far. However, slowly but surely, they move around a bit. Northern baboons differ significantly from their southern counterparts, and western baboons from eastern ones, with smooth transitional zones between them. It was likely the same with Australopithecus. Although we don't have many fossils from the regions in between, what we do have suggests a gradual spread. Later on, as Australopithecus evolved into the Homo genus around 2.5 to 2 million years ago, these migrations were still modest but present. Even the robust Australopithecines, or Paranthropus, were moving around. Sometimes we find fossils in surprising places, indicating that migrations did happen. It's not like they planned to settle new lands. They moved chaotically, like a Brownian motion. If they found a similar area nearby with resources and no competition, they would naturally spread out over time. Kilometer by kilometer, over millions of years, they eventually reached new continents. The key turning point in our sedentary evolution was around 2 million years ago when our ancestors finally started moving further and becoming more mobile. This migration was a long process. Our early ancestors, like Australopithecus, were bipedal but had short legs and stocky builds. Finally, the first Homo species developed longer legs and more modern body proportions. A great example is the skeleton known as Canem WT 15000, or the Turkana boy. This Homo ergaster skeleton is about 1.5 million years old. Turkana boy, an adolescent, had long legs, a shortened rib cage, and relatively narrow shoulders. In modern times, his physique wouldn't stand out much among teenagers, but his face was a bit different. These long-legged humans were adapted for long-distance travel. They also had to modify their heat regulation systems to avoid overheating in open spaces. They overcame these challenges and learned to spread out far and wide. Interestingly, around 2 million years ago, we start finding humans outside of Africa. As I mentioned, while animals like ostriches, antelopes, donkeys, and others had moved in and out of Africa multiple times, our ancestors were some of the last to venture out. People often ask skeptically, why did they leave Africa if it was so good there? Why head north where it's cold and scary? Well, they didn't have maps or navigators. They didn't know about Africa or Eurasia. They just moved. If there was a similar savanna nearby with resources, they'd head there. Plus, the climate was about 4 degrees warmer than today. Places like southern Europe and parts of Asia were tropical paradises with elephants, rhinos, hippos, and ostriches. Walking slowly little by little, they moved north. Over 500,000 years, they gradually spread to new areas. Each step was small. Before this, there was a long prep period with our short-legged, sturdy Australopithecus ancestors. Eventually, early Homo species evolved longer legs and more modern proportions. One great example is the KNMWT 15,000 skeleton, also known as the Turkana boy or Neriakatome boy. This Homo ergaster skeleton is about 1.5 million years old and shows a young adolescent with long legs, a shorter ribcage, and relatively narrow shoulders. Physically not so different from modern teens, except for a slightly scary face. With their long legs and better heat regulation, these early humans could travel long distances. That's why, around 2 million years ago, we find evidence of humans outside Africa. Despite other animals repeatedly migrating in and out of Africa, our ancestors were among the last to leave. A common question is, why did they leave Africa if it was so great? Why move north to colder places? Well, early humans didn't have maps or GPS. They simply moved through savannas, following resources. Around 2 million years ago, global temperatures were about 4 degrees warmer than today, making many regions more hospitable. As they moved slowly bit by bit, they ended up in places like Georgia's Dmanisi site, where we find 5 amazing skulls and a rich array of fauna. These early migrations were gradual and opportunistic, not planned expeditions. Recent discoveries in Saudi Arabia and even the island of Socotra show that these early humans ventured far. Socotra, located between Arabia and East Africa, wasn't connected to the mainland, meaning early Homo species had to cross the ocean somehow. Despite common stereotypes, these ancient humans weren't primitive, club-wielding cavemen. They were intelligent, adapting to new environments and solving problems. They could lash together logs to create rafts and navigate to new lands. Later, we find Acheulean tools on islands like Crete, Cyprus, and various Greek islands, showing that ancient humans repeatedly crossed water. They reached places like Florus over 1 million years ago, which means even early Homo erectus managed sea crossings of 30 kilometers. Though they didn't reach Australia until much later, these journeys demonstrate their ingenuity and resilience. These weren't just random wanderers. They were problem solvers, innovators, and survivors. Of course, they never made it to America, so there were clear limitations. It's important not to overestimate their migration abilities. Their movements were slow and gradual, initially confined to tropical zones. They left Africa, spreading within the continent before venturing out. Some went left to Europe, others right to Asia. Migration was fairly rapid within these coastal regions, but they didn't venture too far inland. Deserts, mountains, jungles, those were no-go zones. Coastal living was familiar. Starting from the coast of, say, Eritrea, they might have crossed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, more likely than the Suez Isthmus, especially during periods of lower sea levels. The strait was only about 2 kilometers wide, and even now, the opposite shore is visible. If baboons, ostriches, and zebras could cross, so could humans. For them, it didn't matter much whether it was the coast of Eritrea or Yemen. The fauna and flora were similar, and they continued their beachcombing lifestyle. Moving north along the Red Sea or Persian Gulf, conditions changed, but moving east along the Indian Ocean coast, through Pakistan, India, and beyond to Indonesia, offered consistent environments. With the ocean on one side and familiar land on the other, they moved forward. The shoreline offered food, while the inland areas were less inviting. Geologically speaking, they spread rapidly once they left Africa. Within no time, they were along the entire coast, reaching Java and the easternmost parts of China. Our precise dating methods can't track every step they took, especially since many coastal sites are now underwater due to glacial melt and rising sea levels. Fishers in China once pulled up a lower jawbone of a Homo erectus, along with some fossil hyenas and other ancient debris. What a catch! Back then, though, that area was dry land. People didn't just migrate east and west along latitudes but north and south along meridians too. Early traces of migration are found in Georgia, but they went further. There were geographical challenges, like when the Black and Caspian Seas connected, creating a water barrier. People occasionally crossed it, as evidenced by a camel bone with deliberate tool marks found in the Levantovka quarry near Rostov-on-Don, dating back around 2 million years. Migrating north was less appealing initially due to harsher climates, but they slowly moved on, eventually encountering new environments. Around 1 to 1.5 million years ago, our ancestors started spreading more widely, evolving into different groups across regions. Thus began the era of diverse human species: Proto-sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and mysterious hobbits on islands like Flores, Luzon, and Sulawesi. Despite their differences, migration continued due to low population densities. By around 500,000 to 400,000 years ago, humans had reached temperate zones. As glaciers advanced during ice ages, humans had to adapt, inventing fire, clothing, and shelters to survive. Interbreeding among different human groups occurred, like Neanderthals with Denisovans and Proto-sapiens. Sapiens later mixed with Denisovans too. Archaeological and genetic evidence often reveal these ancient interactions, sometimes in surprising ways. One of my favorite examples is the femur from Dolní Věstonice 35, found in Czechia. Even today, Czechia is in Central Europe, but back then, it was more like the edge of Europe, with glaciers just to the north. Dolní Věstonice is rich with cultural artifacts, and the number 35 indicates there are at least 34 more fascinating finds. This particular femur belonged to a tall, strong man, and isotope analysis revealed he spent most of his life eating seafood. So, he grew up near the Mediterranean Sea but ended up in Czechia, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coast, during the peak of the Ice Age around 26,000 years ago. As an adult, he likely walked this vast distance, not in a straight line due to the Alps, but through zigzags, meeting different tribes with their own languages and cultures. He eventually settled in Dolní Věstonice, where he ended his journey. To me, he's the greatest traveler of all time. It's one thing for populations to migrate over generations, but this individual covered hundreds of kilometers alone. He survived unfamiliar terrain and various encounters, showcasing the resilience and adaptability of early humans. Absolutely. Individual cases like this illustrate broader migration patterns. By tracking the movement of objects like amber, cowrie shells, unique flint or obsidian types, we get a picture of these migrations. Take the young person from the Arini cave in northern Italy. His burial site was adorned with various artifacts, including beads made from shells. While living by the sea explains the shell beads, he also had a cowrie shell likely from the far south, a mammoth ivory pendant likely from the north, and reindeer antler scepters made in France. These indicate wide-ranging trade or exchange networks. He also had a black flint blade from France, showing far-reaching connections. Such finds, like seashells found deep in France, whale bone items far from any ocean, or Baltic amber in distant locations like Voronezh, show how far people and their goods traveled. These movements weren't just for survival, they were about culture and connection. Artifacts like Venus figurines, ornaments, and tools show similar styles across Germany, Austria, Czechia, and beyond to the Irkutsk region of Siberia, suggesting widespread cultural exchange among Homo sapiens. They spread east and north, even reaching the Arctic regions like the Yana site. And so, their paths diverged. The luckiest ones followed the southern routes, retracing the steps of earlier Homo erectus migrations. They ended up in places like Flores and Timor, eventually reaching Sahul, a landmass combining New Guinea, Australia, and Tasmania. As sea levels rose, Sahul split into separate islands, leaving people scattered across them. By around 36,000 years ago, if not earlier, humans reached places like the Solomon Islands, Bougainville, and Buka. These ancient people were catching oceanic fish, indicating they had well-built boats. The nearest islands were at least 300 kilometers away, showing their impressive seafaring skills. Migration across Melanesia is traced through obsidian, volcanic glass unique to specific volcanoes. Geologists have become adept at pinpointing the source of obsidian, revealing that it was transported thousands of kilometers across islands. While the southern route saw such maritime journeys, the northern path was taken by those not afraid of the cold. Neanderthals had ventured north, but they didn't go far beyond the Altai Mountains. However, by around 20,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, Homo sapiens pushed further north and east. They reached Beringia, the land bridge connecting modern-day Chukotka with Alaska. Although Beringia was mostly glaciated, people likely traveled along the coastlines, aided by their boats. For thousands of years, they navigated by keeping land to their left and water to their right, a strategy that had served them from Africa to the Americas. Despite glaciation, they continued to move, driven by the promise of new lands. Waves always brought signs of land from the east, so they ventured onwards, guided by their survival instincts and navigational skills. Even during the Soviet era with its Iron Curtain, anthropologists studying Eskimos and Chukchi found Coca-Cola bottles in remote villages. When asked, the locals pointed east and said they got them from relatives. Iron Curtain or not, they'd hop on sleds in winter or kayaks in summer and travel. Who could stop them? Certainly not the border guard stationed far away. And ancient humans in the Stone Age had even fewer restrictions. By around 30,000 years ago, more reliably between 25,000 and 24,000 years ago, and definitely by 14,000 years ago, humans had reached America. Evidence suggests there may have been 3 separate migrations, around 30,000 years ago, another 24,000 years ago, and a third around 14,000 years ago. The first waves might not have left many descendants, but the last one was successful. By then, the Ice Age was ending, Siberia was densely populated, and there was a well-established route for migrating groups. When they reached America, it was like paradise. No competition, abundant wildlife, and untapped resources. This led to rapid expansion southward, reaching the southern tip of South America. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, dating back to 14,000 years ago, possibly up to 18,000 years, show that humans quickly spread through the continent. Migration continued with two main routes, one along the Pacific coast and another through the interior. By 10,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had settled the entire planet. Denisovans, Neanderthals, and hobbits were gone, with only small, isolated groups remaining. People kept migrating, reaching places like Madagascar, Tahiti, Haiti, and Hawaii. By the 15th century, the planet was fully settled. Now, we've run out of new lands to explore, but our history of migration tells a remarkable story of human resilience and adaptability. Indeed, at least 30,000 years separate us from the time of the Neanderthals, and even more in some regions. Modern populations, like those near Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, are far removed from their ancient predecessors. Everyone outside Africa has a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, but it's not specifically tied to any current location. Over the last few thousand years, the population in places like southern Siberia has changed several times. First, Proto-Europeans moved from west to east. Then, Mongoloids moved from east to west, culminating in events like the Tatar-Mongol invasion. Later, Russian settlers moved in, followed by Cossacks and peasants. This constant movement means that current populations have little direct connection to those ancient ancestors. In modern times, people continue to move around. So, we're all connected in a very broad and indirect way, shaped by thousands of years of migration and mixing. It's fascinating to think how dynamic and interconnected human history really is. As people migrated and settled in new territories, they became distinct for various reasons: adaptation, genetics, and specialization. This led to different physical characteristics like skin color and hair types. This phenomenon happened with Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and even modern humans. Less mobile populations developed distinct traits faster. In Africa today, where people have mostly stayed put, we see a variety of races. While people outside Africa might find it hard to distinguish between different African groups, Africans themselves can clearly tell the difference, much like Europeans distinguish between Southern and Northern Europeans. Anthropologists study these differences, but Africa's complex political and logistical landscape makes this challenging. Nevertheless, migration, interbreeding, and adaptation have played significant roles in forming races. Even without moving, populations can develop unique characteristics over time. In recent history, migrations in Africa continued. The Bantu expansion from West Africa to southern regions shaped many cultures. Similarly, migrations from Ethiopia to the south brought the Maasai, who are still expanding in Kenya and Tanzania today. So, it's not just ancient mixtures that created races. Modern movements have also played a crucial role. And that's a whole different story. As humans spread out across the globe, it had an interesting impact on our genetics. Take the DRD4 gene, for example. While everyone has this gene, the number of copies varies among people. This gene regulates dopamine receptors. Dopamine, a chemical linked to pleasure and reward, has receptors that, when working well, make us feel good. If these receptors aren't as effective, people might seek more dopamine through new experiences. Interestingly, different groups have different numbers of DRD4 copies. For instance, Bushmen in southern Africa have a version that makes them restless. They can't sit still, they need to move and explore. If they don't, they risk starvation in the harsh desert. On a genetic level, this wanderlust is ingrained. In contrast, Chinese or Japanese people, who come from agricultural societies, often have a different version. These societies valued stability, with people tending their fields and focusing on slow, meticulous work. Their dopamine receptors work great, so they feel content without needing to explore. They find satisfaction in their daily routines, like tending to a rice paddy or crafting something from jade. These genetic differences illustrate how our migrations and lifestyles shaped us in unique ways. Evolution tailored our instincts to the environments we lived in, whether it was the endless movement of hunter-gatherers or the settled life of farmers. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. If you know more about migrations than I do or have migrated more, feel free to leave a couple of dislikes. They help the channel grow too. Share your thoughts and stories about migration, where you think it will lead us, and let's keep the conversation going. Don't be afraid to migrate, but let's not go overboard. And if you're really adventurous, aim for the stars. Support the channel, share your impressions with friends and family, and let's create a bright future together. Catch you in the next video.